Wow, with two voices.
Carol.
Bravo. This is a wonderful introduction. Il y a longtemps que nous nous aimons.
On se connaît depuis longtemps.
On a un peu l'impression. Good evening. My name is Mark Mayer. I'm the director of Arsenal Contemporary New York. Welcome to all of you. Thierry de Duve is not someone who needs an introduction in my world or probably yours, but for form's sake, I'll sketch one out. Born and educated in Belgium, and also in Germany, Thierry is among our most relevant living commentators on art, culture, and thought. A noted scholar of Marcel Duchamp, on whom he's written several books, notably Kant after Duchamp, Pictorial Nominalism, on Duchamp's passage from painting to the ready-made, Duchamp's Telegram, from Beaux-Arts to art in general. Other books include Clement Greenberg, Between the Lines, Look, 100 Years of Contemporary Art, as well as Aesthetics at Large. He's currently working on a new book, Farewell to Romanticism. We'll all be waving along with you. An art historian and a philosopher of art, of course, but a wide-ranging thinker who has also written on feminism and gender, as well as a great many articles about recent art in all of our favorite periodicals. Thierry has been awarded many distinctions and taught in many schools, and is currently the Evelyn Cranes Cossack Professor at Hunter College. On a personal note, Thierry was on the selection committee that hired me to be the head of visual arts at the Canadian Cultural Center in Paris way back in 1990. A life-changing appointment, et j'en suis infiniment reconnaissant. You may not remember, but I sure do. Carol Wainio is one of Canada's most accomplished painters. You just have to look around the room for confirmation of that. You'll stay up late trying to identify a Canadian museum where she is not exhibited, but her work has also been presented at the Venice Biennale, the Galleria Comunale d'Arte Moderna di Bologna, the State Museum in Amsterdam, and the Beijing Biennial, among other distinguished venues. Her paintings are particularly popular with Canadian public collections and have been for decades. In 2014, she was honored with the Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts, a very high honor indeed, but certainly not the only one that she's merited. Carol has held academic positions at the University of Ottawa, as well as Concordia University in Montreal. She is represented by the Paul Petro Gallery in Toronto and our friends at the Trepagny Bear Gallery in Calgary. Carol is interested in rethinking representation and pushing its possibilities to include subject matter that has heretofore been out of painting's reach. Unfathomably, this is her very first solo exhibition in New York, but there will certainly be others. I would like to thank Anne McCoy for her beautiful and perceptive review of Carol's work in this month's Brooklyn Rail, and thank you for being here with us tonight, Anne. And now, over to you, Thierry and Carol.
Yes. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Carol and I go way back. We were friends 35 years ago. Wow, well, that doesn't make us any younger. But we were friends and colleagues at the University of Ottawa in Canada in the 80s. I have been seeing her work ever since then, but at very large intervals. And when I entered this gallery, I immediately recognized a palette which is very unusual, very rare, and very unique. And the subject matter has become much more complex since then, and won me over immediately. So why don't we, Carol, if you want, why don't we start with the subject matter and fairy tales and fables. And in this exhibition, as I understand it, there are 2 fairy tales by Perrault, right? And 2 fables, or 3 fables by La Fontaine that are used. So why don't you start with that?
Yeah, so where they, it's kind of interesting to, in talking with Thierry, it's kind of interesting to think about where those came from, as they were in some ways related, in other ways not related to the kind of work that I was doing when I first met you in the late 80s. It was my very first job out of grad school, and Thierry was teaching at the University of Ottawa, and I used to sit in on his art history lectures, which were fabulous because you were working on pictorial nominalism then. But at the time, I was just out of grad school, and I was looking at other kinds of narratives, and they were sort of this is a sort of narrative of modernism, the origins of the avant-garde, things like that, in terms of figures in specific grounds, kind of looking at the historical grounds of those kinds of things. But they were sort of figure ground kinds of relationships of ideas as figures. And then in terms of the fairy tales, which I kind of
Can I
relate.
interrupt you?
Yep.
Since you were talking about those years, right out of grad school, doing figurative painting, in a context where figurative painting was really
Absolutely
not
not.
à la mode, right?
No, not at all.
And then you also studied at NASCAR,
Before that,
where figurative painting was
also
kind of
not à la
taboo
mode. Yes,
and
yeah.
completely conceptual art was it. So tell us something.
Yeah, so that the work that I was doing at the time in just out of grad school was work that was definitely not à la mode. It was sort of narrative in the sense of, or trying to sort of picture kind of processes of ideas and changing ideas. And I had done in grad school, I did, rather than some of the courses that were required, I sort of went outside of those fields into history and the history of ideas. So I was doing really kind of demanding kind of history stuff where you really had to read texts, full texts, like an entire year of reading, for instance, everything from John Locke's entire 2 treatises of government, or right up to anything recent, except for the most recent cool stuff that was being taught in grad school. So it was a really strong kind of grounding of those kinds of figures in a historical ground, where you had to kind of like place them in context. You had to see how those things developed. And the fairy tales, my interest in those when they developed came more out of having children and reading those kinds of texts. And I think I approached those kinds of texts, those sort of, as opposed to the sort of kind of high theoretical philosophical texts, and thinking about them in their historical grounds, because I had a really strong interest in sort of history from below. I thought I started dealing with the fairy tales in a more experiential way.
When did you start working with the fairy tales?
When I had children.
Which
In the 1990s.
The audience might not know when you had children.
Yes, so I had children in 1994 and 1997, but prior to that I'd lost quite a few. I had a series of ectopic pregnancies, lost a number of children, and so there were relationships between that kind of history of ideas and trying to understand issues that I felt were the most problematic when modernism most usefully via Walter Benjamin. And those things informed the sort of reading of fairy tales, or the study of fairy tales, which became a study after the experience of reading to children, to young children, in a very particular way. And I think you can't really, it seems odd to say it, but you can't underestimate how different it is now to be in a situation where one was not constantly online. We lived in a kind of small town in between, and there was this kind of rhythm of reading these tales to children in this repetitive, almost sort of pre-modern sort of way, where these simple tales became
You mentioned Walter Benjamin. We might come back to that, but
Yep.
you're the one and only person that I know who is so interested in the fact that Walter Benjamin collected children's books.
Yeah. No, and I ended up going to his children's book collection in Frankfurt. So it was just this kind of long process, and they're kind of related studies in the sense in terms of why fairy tales. I mean, I got the same bizarre, I wouldn't say it's a thrill, a sense of the kind of, how can you say, sort of the ground shifting from, reading an enormous number of original texts, full texts, historical texts, philosophical texts, whatever, from Leviathan to Nietzsche, right? And trying to process them and finding the same kind of feeling of how it's almost like history coming alive. I mean, sort of.
How does that connect with painting? You're kind of self-taught as a painter, aren't you?
In some ways, because figurative painting wasn't being taught there. It was just painting has always been just a way of kind of picturing these things for myself. Either of these processes, any of these things, it's a way of kind of thinking through these things.
When you were at NASCAR, Eric Fisher was there, right?
Yes.
Was he a professor of
Yeah,
yours
he was.
at the time?
He wasn't a professor of mine.
Oh.
But
he was the only painter. Oh no, maybe.
He was the only narrative painter, and we sort of connected kind of outside of that, and we did these performance works together as well. And he would just come over to the studio, and we had adjoining studios, and we ended up doing performance work, my husband Paul Terage and I, together at that time. And yeah. So,
and Paul is a musician, right?
Yeah, well, he's a professor of cultural studies, but his background's in music composition and things like that, and musical technology. Again, kind of looking at music in a similar way in terms of a kind of broader context. And that's what the fairy tales were for me. They became a kind of those narratives, popular narratives, vernacular narratives. I was kind of relating to historical documents and historical texts in ways through kind of close study of them and going back to their sources, going back to the original illustrations of these texts from.
Okay, so let's talk about the illustrations because your relationship to fairy tales, of course you have read the fairy tales, Perrault and all, and the Grimm brothers also?
I'm never that keen on the Grimm brothers.
No?
I really kind of focused on the Perrault collection. One, it's a smaller collection. Two, it was more widely reproduced, and three, they just seem to have much more sort of metaphorical potential.
Okay, so where did you find the iconography based on those fairy tales? Can you tell us something about
I started doing archival research. Once my kids got old enough that I could leave them for a little while, I started doing archival research online, and also actually going to see these books, the earliest ones in archives, and sort of tracing how they went from the first, illustrations. And when you actually get in the archives and you realize these books are like this big, right, and the illustrations are like this.
With what technique?
Oh, all kinds of techniques, and that was one of the things I was interested in terms of the Benjamin archives, right, because I was interested in how they were reproduced, right, so first they're hand copied. You can sort of trace the mechanical reproduction of them. So I was really interested in Benjamin's, the kind of strange dichotomy or, potential kind of conflict between the more popular texts of his, like the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction and the way that was received, and his interest in storytelling, his writings on storytelling, his interest in children's books, collecting them, all of those kinds of things. There was a real kind of disconnect between those things. And I was interested in looking at the earliest ways that these things were hand copied, and his writings on, the earlier illustrations, you can see that they're kind of copied by hand. You'll have a little engraving. A little engraving this big, and then you'll find another version where it's clearly based on that same illustration, but it might be a woodcut or another kind of engraving, and then it becomes mechanically reproduced, and you can find these things kind of in different editions. You can trace the entire history. Yes.
Throughout the 19th century, or what?
Oh well, from 1695, and then how these different tales specific ones, especially in the Perrault collection, like Le Chaboté, Le Maître Chat, Puss in Boots, how they become used in all of these different ways. You know, some of them are really integrated into kind of capitalist kinds of things, become incredibly reproduced in fascinating, amazing ways in early advertising. Others are used in different ways in sort of Le Petit Poucet, for instance, becomes
What
this
can
thing.
you advertise with the Chaboté?
Everything. I'm not joking. I'm not joking. It wasn't just boots and shoe polish. It was. It's the tale of. This is what I found so fascinating. That it's this tale of, you know, based in a sort of feudal pre-modern society where there's no possibility of social advancement, right? So representation becomes this trick to sort of assume another position when there is no way to possibly advance.
So
socially.
maybe some of us in the room, including myself, are not that familiar with the fairy tales. I mean, I've read them as a child and probably forgot most of them. So let's concentrate on a few that are here. Le Petit Poucet and Le Chaboté. Let's talk about those two in terms of subject matter, in terms of why would a painter of the 21st century be interested in fairy tales that were written in the 1600s?
So, Le Petit Poucet is more represented here. Le Chaboté is sort of earlier work, but the drawing.
So this is Le Petit Poucet.
Le Petit Poucet.
This also.
No, that's
No.
That's sort of more le lièvre et la tortue.
We'll
Ça c'est Le
come back
Petit
to
Poucet
that.
Parlot, and in the other room there's a number of them. So these are fables. But why is that interesting? Because that particular fairy tale, after the interest in I kind of explored the other tales a fair bit, but as things like climate change became,
Sorry for interrupting.
Yep.
Can you just remind us what the story
Oh,
of
the story.
Le
Le
Petit
Petit
Poucet is? What is the English translation of the Tom
the
Thumb?
English translate, no, Tom Thumb is a different story.
Oh.
It's Hop on My Thumb. Hop on My Thumb.
Oh my God.
But it's not really well known. Le Petit Poucet is well known in French as a tale. And I mean, I think of it, I'm mostly interested in the trope of the children being abandoned in the wood. It's
So tell us the story.
So the story is that Le Petit Poucet is the smallest, kind of impossibly small child in his family, 7 brothers. Poor woodcutter's family with conditions of scarcity, which are the origins of fairy tale, right? They're all in conditions of scarcity and, you know, sort of hierarchical social structures and da-da-da-da.
Is very interesting.
Yeah.
I want you to delve into the da-da-da-da just because
Well,
I
won't
don't
get to
take
the
for
story.
granted that this audience knows these fairy tales by heart.
Well, conditions of scarcity and, you know, impossibility of social advancement, you know, rigid social situations, sumptuary laws, primogeniture we were talking about. Anyway, things like that.
That's already too abstract. Carol, I
Poverty, abandoned children. My interest in the story
Okay.
is of abandonment of children. It is a trope in Hansel and Gretel. You know, you don't want to care for your kids, you take them in the woods and you leave them there. And that is a complete
and that has a
for me.
basis in reality.
Well, it did at the time, yes. Children were
But that's
cheap.
what I
Yes,
want
yes.
to know.
At that, you know, at the time, children were not expected to live long. If you didn't have many of them, they would die anyway. You dump them in the woods, whatever. But I'm thinking of it in terms of why I'm using it. It's really about a kind of, I guess, increasingly it became, it wasn't a tale I was interested in at first, but became a kind of metaphor for what is going on right now in terms of climate change and abandoning future generations to whatever. And they got to figure it out and find their way out of it, and we're just abdicating responsibility and leave them in the woods.
Okay, so we're still talking about the Petit Poucet and how that metaphorical meaning for today translates into the iconography
Right.
and vice versa, how the iconography gives way to your own metaphorical interpretation.
Yeah. And the particular
Let's talk
iconography.
about this one, for
Yeah.
example, because everybody has it in front of their eyes.
So the iconography for that tale, I mean, it's interesting because I did look at, like, it's in the original Perrault collection from 1695 all the way up. So I've kind of looked at the entire history of those illustrations. And what became interesting was with something like Le Chaboté, that became used incredibly in advertising. Le Petit Poucet did not. Well, occasionally it was used for advertising. The little dude would be selling flashlight batteries or cars, things like that, to get out of the forest or things like that. But it also became heavily used in photo postcards, sort of tableau vivant, kind of early 20th, late 19th century.
Which reconstitute
Yes.
a scene like
That
comes
what-
out
that comes
of
from a
a
postcard.
tableau vivant.
Yeah, so I started collecting these photo postcard series that were produced. And they were just odd because, just trying to figure out why this tale was used for that. They were very sweet, they were beautiful, kind of hand tinted.
You could not guess that those children were abandoned.
No, because they're not
going to die.
No, they're not represented that way. Partly because I think that the sources of that particular iconography from those postcards are part of another kind of history of childhood, sort of a 19th century invention of childhood as this kind of particular time. And because the children presented beautiful sort of subjects, they became these tableau vivant subjects in these photo postcards, which were based on the illustrations. You can actually trace them back. But
Okay,
these
so
sort of
where
framed
does
things-
I must say that in a book on your work, I saw the original image from
Yeah.
which this is
Yeah.
taken. So can you describe it? Can you tell us where is your invention? Where is it literal transcription?
So it's
of what
kind
you
of
saw?
literal transcription, more or less where the figures are, although I've excerpted one of them and some other things. And then I've just kind of placed them in this kind of ground that's sort of just a sort of, I'm kind of restaging these things, right? So I'm restaging these narratives and restaging them in a kind of, in these instances, the grounds are more theatrical because those postcards were very theatrically staged, and they had a lot to do with a particular kind of way of kind of framing within the frame that you find at that time that came from illustration with the given frame. But I've restaged them in a kind of a ground that is a kind of forest that is where the sort of top part is more kind of referencing a lot of things. It's referencing the kind of marbled papers of the previous illustrations that came before them.
Can you
The
marbled
marbled paper of the sort of illustrated books in
Yeah.
which the tales would be found.
like the first page
Yes,
on the cover,
like
in the
yes,
inside cover.
yeah. And the framing at times, yes. So that's, so there are references to those kinds of things as well. And then sort of overlaid on top are these
The
sort
black
of trees.
lines. The black lines?
Yes,
What are
they're sort of children's drawings of trees, which appear in a lot of the works as kind of references to another kind of more primordial sort of narrative of sort of the seasons as a narrative.
Did you use your own children's drawings?
Not in these cases.
But did you collect them?
I have all the
Okay,
children's
no,
drawings,
that's interesting.
yeah. So, and that it's just another register of the kind of narrative of sort of loss of a certain kind of narrative, loss of the narrative of the sort of reassuring narrative of regular seasons, which is disappearing for our generation of lost children, right? We're not going to have them as a narrative.
So I remember that the original postcard focused on the group of children with the basket, some leaves on the trees. Where did you get that kind of tunnel that leads to a light in the background from?
I didn't get it from anywhere. I mean, it might have come a bit from some other postcard of that series. Sometimes I'll combine several, but I didn't put the figure in it. I just wanted a kind of an exit, potential exit for them.
Is that kind of symbolic meaning?
Oh, symbolic, I don't know. I mean,
No.
you don't want to be...
You're not a symbolist painter.
No.
But still, is it like a light of hope or whatever?
It could be that, or it could be just also, as a painter, a kind of push back in this. It is a push back into the space, but it's also a space that flips forward. So all of those things are going on.
Okay, push back.
It's a push back in terms of a kind of, a hole in that space, but it's also really much more chunkily painted, and it jumps forward. So it's just kind of setting up a spatial thing.
Yeah.
Which,
so that's the old push and pull.
Yes.
it's still valid if you're a painter, no?
Yeah.
And so if we forget the iconography in the bottom part of and we focus on the upper rather thin part, and it becomes completely abstract there.
Yeah.
So,
but
how do you proceed? I'm always curious. I mean, there are very few painters that mix abstraction and figurative work the way you do. I don't know anyone actually. Richter does an abstract painting, and then he does a figurative painting, but he doesn't mix them.
Yeah. That really just comes from the stuff that I'm investigating and exploring, because it is kind of based on all of these different sources over time. I'm kind of putting them together, so I've got much.
So what you said about the marble paper in the books, that's the upper part there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so all of that stuff, as I was saying, with all of these things, they just get kind of mixed. It's a long history of this iconography, of these images, of these narratives.
And it's important to you that you don't only refer to the original tale itself, but to its history.
Yes.
Its reception history via iconography.
Its reception history and the different ways that it has manifested, whether it's through advertising, whether it's through postcards, whether it's through this, and then kind of relating it to a kind of, like I said at the beginning, in terms of figures and grounds, it's like putting these things.
But contrary to some more overtly political artists, the iconography does not lead immediately to the political content that's there. You have to work at it, right?
I guess you do. I don't know. It seems obvious to me that we're abandoning our children to a pretty messed up world, but some people wonder why this trope of abandoning children is there.
But it's worth being said.
Yeah, no, it is.
So let us take Le Lièvre et la Tortue. So we're moving from fairy tales to fables, La Fontaine, which always have a moral at the end. And Le Lièvre et la Tortue, the hare and the tortoise. There are, how many? 3? This one also?
Non, ça c'est le loup et l'agneau.
Le loup et l'agneau. So let's talk about these two, since these two are about the hare. And I remember that when we talked, 2 things, I have 2 questions. One is one of my students who is in the room pointed out the division. That's the straight vertical division in that particular painting. So we're going to talk a little bit about form, also formally about that. That's my first question. My second question, I remember having asked you where you got your hair from. Not your hair, the rabbit. And it's kind of obvious that it comes from still lives of dead hares. Whether it's Chardin or other, but you told me you just pivoted the hair, so that's it. Can you, I mean, I've said too much already.
Yeah, no, that's what, well, I mean, the difference between the sort of fairy tale works and the fable works, basically, is that the fairy tale works had a much greater range of source material, very specific and very different source material that I was using.
Iconographically speaking.
Well, yeah, from advertising to postcards to this to that to, you know, there was just a richer history to really delve into. With fables, one, they're different than fairy tales in a lot of ways. They're short, they're, you know, not as interesting. I became interested in them partly through working on the Le Petit Poucet story, which was really coming out of concerns about climate change and, you know, future generations. So, Le Lièvre et la Tortue, which was the first sort of fable I started looking at, I was looking at in terms of like the way that animal voices of fable would just seem so plaintively different in the context of the Anthropocene and climate change.
Oh.
That was my original sort of feeling about that, you know, that they were just the way that they spoke, so nobly and so soberly and rationally in this ground of climate change.
So the fact that animals speak is essential to fables.
Yes,
Aesop
absolutely,
from
yes.
Aesop to La
And they
Fontaine.
speak very briefly, if you want, and then to go to the source. I mean, they're short. Fables are not very interesting, and you know, Benjamin Blake.
I can still recite a few of La Fontaine's.
Yeah.
Not entirely. It's
Anyway.
the thing that every francophone still
Yes, I know.
giant learns by
It's
by
much
heart
more
in
common.
primary school.
It's
so.
much more common in French and in Quebec, in France and
Yeah.
Quebec, La Belgique aussi. But so there weren't sources to look at for me. There wasn't this rich and crazy tradition of different ways that these tales were translated and passed down over centuries. There's not that many interesting sources to look at, so I just started looking at what sources I could use because I wanted to use them. And for something like Le Lièvre et la Tortue, you know, there were a few genre paintings at the time that you could find for any of these fables, not many. So I just ended up accidentally looking at contemporaneous painting, right? So I'm looking at 17th century Dutch genre painting of Le Butin de la Chasse, you know, the hunting scenes, the spoils of the hunt, things like that, right? And just got struck by how incredibly beautiful they were. They were just stunningly beautiful. The sort of, you know, Dutch ones, mostly I was more drawn to the Dutch version.
The rendering of the fur and all that kind of
Yeah, I mean, they were just so gorgeous. So I just started pulling, you know, animals from those sources where I could, and particularly because there were millions of these images of the dead hares hung by one leg. And if I just turned them, they looked like they were running or dancing. They always seemed to be turned face to in this kind of way, right? But they're always in the images. The head is like looking at you, and if you turn them, it's like a performance. It's like a ballet. It's like whatever. So I just started working with those sources in that way.
That one is
That one's sort of sleeping. It's that sort of weird thing in the fable. Is it sleeping or is it dead, right? Because it takes a nap, so you don't know, is it dead or is it sleeping? So that one's sort of sleeping.
Okay.
Most of them, like the small one in there, are ones where I've taken the dead hair and turned it sideways.
So you've told us where the dead hair, which is no longer dead, the running hair comes from.
Bringing it to life.
The tortoise obviously is more like a children's drawing.
Yes. Yeah.
So why did you give the turtle a different treatment?
Well, because I'm thinking of that fable as well in terms of generational climate change kinds of issues. So, I mean, there's a lot there's quite a number of paintings I did on that particular thing, and they're either usually the tortoises. I mean that's a children's drawing over there too. The top in the top,
There's a huge
it's
tortoise
a huge
there.
tortoise there that looks like a planet or something like that.
So in La Fontaine's fable, the tortoise wins the race.
Yes,
So
although
what
it's
is-
very ambiguous, that
okay,
that
tell
whole
us.
story. There's more ambiguity to it. There's other versions of that fable, later versions where, yeah, the tortoise wins the race and all's great, whatever. And then there are versions where it's sort of rewritten in the 19th century, I believe, where the tortoise has won the race, and then there's another, and apparently there's a fire in the forest, a great fire, and a changed fire. I mean, we're inundated with fires in Canada right now. The season's just starting. And so the people, the animals of the forest to get together and decide, since the tortoise won the race, we will send the tortoise out to warn all the other animals in the forest of the great fire. And of course, the tortoise is slow, and all the animals die. It's like, there's various versions of iterations of these stories. But anyway, so in my paintings, usually the tortoise is either a children's drawing of a tortoise, because children draw tortoises and they do them in interesting ways, and that's like some vague, hopeful whatever for the future of children all over the planet. Or else it's sometimes represented as a kind of compost, which it is in the one behind you.
You have to reconnect it.
Oh, is it? Did I just
No, I
disconnect
think it's
this?
still working.
Oh,
Oh,
unplugged.
I suppose this is the way.
Forgot
Can
that was
we-
on me. Is that working?
yes.
You'll have to edit this out. Oh, no, it's
Hold on.
looking at me. So in this one, the tortoise,
That
the one behind you,
Yeah.
it's hard to see, but the tortoise, without pointing it out, and I don't dare get up, but there's a kind of pile of compost in those sort of moorings and tunnels, and the sort of tortoise head that comes out. So they're usually piles
Oh yeah, I
of sort
see
of
the tortoise.
of
but
kind of
don't go.
compost and vegetation, regrowth out of
But there's also an archaeological site in there,
Yeah.
no?
Yeah.
What is the
So that
function
one
of
is just
that?
thinking about sort of, I had just stumbled across some digs at the time of, some recently unearthed mosaics and tunnels, so I was thinking about, I know hares don't burrow, poetic license, they live above ground, but rabbits burrow, and I was just thinking about, I was just looking at these images that seemed like a kind of archaeology of existence, animal existence. I mean, obviously I'm using this animal thing as a kind of metaphor for kind of human sort of time, so I just kind of put those things together, the sort of animal burrows and the archaeological digs, and the sort of hope for maybe finding something out of that.
So is that like a projection into the future, when future archaeologists will discover the remnants of our civilization?
I don't know if it's that specific, but that's, something like that, possibly, yes. Just relating those things, human history and animal history, and human, the ways that animals are used to project human issues. So, yeah, it seemed like a thing.
Okay, what about, to go back to the fairy tales, what about the Chaboté? So that's, tell the story, first of all.
Oh, the story. I just went back and reread it because it's so. And most people only know it through the Disney versions and things like that. But it's a crazy story of sort of again a tale of set in a time where there's no possibility of anything advancement. So this peasant boy is father dies, leaves the mill to the older brother, the cow or something else, the horse or whatever, to the second brother, and he's left with a cat. That's all. Just a cat.
He's left with a cat,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So it's just a story of trickery, of incredible sort of trickery to sort of get out of sort of poverty. I'm interested in it very much in terms of, I use it in terms of this, the only example here is in the sort of Trump drawing, where, as Anne talked about it in her review, it's a drawing of Le Chaboté that is Walter Benjamin's favorite illustrator, Lisa, and Lisa, Johann Peter Lisa, and he, this illustrator used created a kind of version of Le Chaboté as a kind of proto-capitalist. He's in a top hat. He's like engaged in the sort of one of the final acts of trickery and stuff to
And what about the boots? Are they les bottes de 7 lieues?
No,
That's a different story.
That's in Le Petit Poucet.
Oh, really?
Yes, that's actually from Le Petit Poucet. Same, yes. Les bottes de 7 lieues. Yeah.
But who has them?
In Le Petit Poucet, Le Petit Poucet.
The ogre, or what?
Yes, Poucet steals them from the ogre. Yes.
That's right.
And in the illustration that is Benjamin's favorite illustrator that I quoted this drawing, it is Le Chaboté is presented as this capitalist, which is very unusual. It's a really unusual representation of.
And the boots are a symbol of his power, or what?
The boots are just one of the sort of exchanges, the kind of exchanges of trickery that allow the cat to convince everyone else through representation that this peasant is actually a king, the Marquis of Carabas or the Marquis of whatever, he invents the term. So it is a complete sort of interesting thing of story of trickery, of advancement, of social mobility when it was not possible, when it was completely prohibited and impossible. And that was this kind of representational kind of thing that was fascinating, which is why this cat gets used in advertising to this incredible degree, right? If you just buy the shoe polish, you can become this. If you buy the boots, you can become this. If you buy that cat sold like, powdered meat, olive oil, Trump chocolates, all kinds of things like that. Just enormous number of products. It sold everything, that cat.
But in what time period?
From the late 19th to early 20th century.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you didn't address the divide there, if you can.
Yeah, no, I would just kind of put things together because as I said, there was no real model for these things. Well, there wasn't really a model for the fairy tale works either. I mean, I would take little bits and work with them. But in those instances, one, I wanted a kind of unstable ground. I want to have a ground that is not stable. Because all of these things are about kind of figure ground interactions, I want the ground to be something that is unstable, that is moving, that shifts, and so also so that where the things I pull out of something are clearly coming from somewhere. I want them to bring some little bit of their source with them, some little bit of something with them, so that you look at the paintings and you go, okay, this comes from somewhere. I don't know where it comes from, but it looks like it comes from some time period. It looks like it has, so there's a kind of discursive relationship set up across the surface between sources that have some kind of recognition, like in that one over there. I mean, the dog and the wolf one, you can see the dog is like just kind of, again,
It also has a vertical divide there.
I mean, they come from different places, and I'm putting them together in different ways, where it's not like a radical break, it's a kind of break, but it's enough to sort of say, okay, this comes from somewhere. Partly because those things have this beauty in the way they're painted.
But is it an anti-illusionistic device that you want the just in case we were taken by the landscape and tempted to go into the depths of the landscape?
It's not anti-illusionistic as a kind of theoretical principle, but I don't like having things that sort of seamlessly fit together. I want the things to come with their history, to come with a little bit of a sense of their place, where they're taken from, or what they represent, because of the different ways that they bring things with them. So that's why they're like that. I'm afraid I'm going to knock this over again. Yeah, so, you know, they all come from different sort of, sometimes different places, times different, traditions different, you know, different sources of various kinds, and they're kind of, there is a tension, and I want that tension to be there. It's the kind of tension I sort of feel, it's the tension I feel about all of this stuff, and I personally just respond to paintings that have more tension in them generally. That's why I like Guston. That's why I've always liked Guston.
To come back to your interest in the children's books that Walter Benjamin collected, and as I said, very few people are interested in that. Did you? And you have looked at other children's books of the time also. Did you? Do you? Can you say something about Benjamin's own taste in children's books?
Oh, his taste was, from the collection I saw, his taste was fairly wide-ranging. I mean, he did like sort of those sort of ABC kinds of books, but fairy tales, from what I understand, were something that he was particularly interested in. He was interested in publishing his own book of fairy tales.
Did he write fairy tales?
No, he didn't write them. He did do those children's radio plays that were interesting. I mean, they weren't remotely childlike. They were bizarre. Are you familiar with them?
No, absolutely.
They're bizarre. They're really strange. The radio plays.
Radio play?
Yeah, he did radio plays in Frankfurt.
And they were broadcast?
The broadcast. They were broadcast. You can read the sort of transcripts.
Are there recordings?
I don't know if they're recordings you can get. Yeah, you can. Yeah.
There are?
There are some recordings. I've read the transcripts, you know, in translation, but they're bizarre. They're not like fairy tales at all. They're sort of like this weird things about robbers and crazy things. They're not for children. The Firth of Forth or Frith, I don't know, these weird railway bridges in Scotland. I mean, kind of catastrophes of various kinds, which are sort of related to fairy tales.
But they were meant for
They were
children's
meant for
publishing?
children. Yes, they were meant for children. Yes, well, I mean, he was having a hard time making a living at the time, right? So he was doing all kinds of stuff at that point. Yeah.
You think that's work that he made to make money?
I don't know. I'm
Was
speculating.
it commissioned?
I can't speak to how the precise reasons for him doing it, but he did them.
Okay.
Yeah, and but fairy tales were something he was very interested in and wanted to do his own collection, apparently, from the research I did. So.
Great. I jotted a few things down from reading the catalog. Your own family history does not appear, I believe, in this show, but it has informed some other works. So your father has a very eventful history, right?
Yeah.
From Finland to Russia.
From
to
Finland
Canada.
to Quebec, to the
From
Saguenay.
Finland, okay.
Finland to, yeah, he was born in Finland.
Saguenay.
And brought to the Saguenay when he was a year old, a little over a year.
Oh.
And then his mother died very shortly after arriving. And then his father died a few years later. So he was orphaned in Canada in Quebec or Canada, we're not sure where exactly, at the end. And he had an uncle who had come with them from Finland. And this we'll go back to the Walter Benjamin thing here because it's interesting. So he was orphaned at the end of the 1920s. Things were really terrible. Things were bad. His uncle was kind of left-leaning, and at the time, before Stalin became known for what he was doing, Finland was being offered, Finns were being recruited from across Canada through handwritten newspapers that circulated and in their communities. Finns were quite literate and skilled, and they had these kind of workers' halls where they had these handwritten newspapers that circulated that were called fist press, made by hand. Anyway, so the uncle took my father to Russia in 1930, and that was a bad idea. And they were sent very shortly to a camp in Siberia, which is where my father grew up, in a camp in Siberia from about age 8 or 9 to when he was forced into the Russian army, which was at that time invading Finland. And because my father was Finnish and they thought they could use him as a asset or a spy, he was parachuted into Finland in the Winter War, supposedly for Russia. But the uncle had realized he'd made a mistake and said, if you ever have a chance, please escape. The uncle surely paid with his life for it. Anyway, so my father's parachuted in, turns himself over, he's interrogated for years. I've only recently found a lot of this out through historians that knew more about his story than I did. And I was told that was because he was an intelligence officer after that, and you didn't talk about that, and the whole Russia-Finland thing was very, very, very tense and difficult for a long time. So my father's then fighting Russia, kind of relevant right now with Ukraine, on skis in the Winter War, skiing across northern Siberia in these sort of, as an intelligence officer in these units with reindeer, sort of long distance patrols into Russia, reindeer and early Nokia. It's the beginning of Nokia. It was in Finnish radio communications. And then Finland loses the war. They didn't lose all their territory like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. But it was very tense, and then the Russians were looking for my father, and he had to escape immediately because he would have been sent back to Russia in shock. So the Finnish army gave him fake papers so he could go to Stockholm. So he escaped.
To what extent does that history inform your work?
I have not speculated a great amount in that, to the extent that it's a very marginal history, and I'm interested in marginal histories and histories of those kinds, perhaps. Yeah, small history. I mean, it dawned on me when I was sort of focusing on the Le Petit Poucet story that this is like, these are stories of lost children, right? And things like that. So lost generations, lost children, sort of tragedies of various kinds, catastrophes of various kinds that all our children will be facing, and millions of children are facing right now. Refugee children all over the planet. So yeah, that informs it in some way, except that history is a very tiny history and it's not a well-known history, but it is a history that was not spoken of because one couldn't speak of it. It was still dangerous when I was a child to even talk about it.
Okay, I have one last question before we open it to the floor, if you don't mind.
There's going to be floor questions.
Yes.
Okay.
I read in your interview with Jessica Bradley that you said that you wanted to understand more than express.
Yes.
I love that formula, so
Yes.
I want you to elaborate on that.
I don't know if I can elaborate. That's just part of, that's just kind of, as a
And I'm
painter,
saying that because one could think that at least some of these paintings are very expressive, if not expressionist.
yeah, but it's not the motivation for me. I mean, like, digging into all these archives is not like a way to express something.
No.
All of it is a way of trying to understand something more. I mean, I came of age in that 80s kind of expressionist mode. I mean, my work never fit into that, that sort of like angsty kind of neo-expressionist thing. I would always look at those things, except for Immendorf maybe. I'd look at that work and go, man is evil, look at us, make them look like dogs, arg, and I would just kind of go, well, why, like, why are we in this position? That was my...
You speak in very articulate way, so does the act of painting help you understand things, or do you understand something that you then want to express in painting? Or does the act of painting itself yield new understanding?
Yes. Well, trying to picture something, and you cannot, trying to make something where I can then, so it's not expression, so I can then look at it and go, okay, is this kind of how things are? Does this tell me something?
Do you belabor your canvases a lot?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Depends.
Oh, let's talk about that one. For example, how did it start? When it?
I would say that
it's
one
such
was
a complex painting.
that one would have been easy. That one was easier to make than this one.
Oh really? Oh yeah. This one. Oh, that one.
The shepherd is asleep.
Okay, okay, what did you understand that you didn't know before you started painting that you understood after having done it, or in the process?
It was more just difficult to give the space the kind of tension I wanted. It's obviously got a different kind of space than that. That has several layers, several places in it. But this one was more complicated to get the spaces to work, to get the ground to sort of feel like it was shifting in the right way. I wanted the ground to shift it's a more complex shift than what you see in those ones, right?
Right, for example, that one has a almost classical landscape in it. If it were not for that divide, you could really read it in perspective. This one is on the verge of abstraction, actually.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in that diversity in your work also.
Yeah, well, some of that just comes from the different sources that were being used. This was, I was working with particular sources. This was a much more kind of mixed range of things, different registers. There were more registers to try and make work, and I wanted more of a sense of a kind of...
What is the theme of this?
That's the title is The Shepherd is Asleep, Le Loup et l'Agneau.
Oh, Le Loup et l'Agneau, yeah.
And The Shepherd is Asleep is Bob Dylan's song.
But The Shepherd is Asleep, that's not a translation of Le Loup et l'Agneau.
No, it's not. The title is The Shepherd is Asleep, Le Loup, /
Okay. So for those who might have forgotten what Le Loup et l'Agneau is about.
It's a fable about lying. It's an incredible fable about lying and power.
And power, yeah. Okay, yeah, but okay. The wolf and the sheep, actually a lamb,
yes, it's a lamb.
are talking. The lamb is
The lamb's
drinking
just
from
drinking
the
from a
river.
stream. The wolf is upstream. The wolf says, you've
can't
poisoned my water, you can't drink it. And the lamb said, the lamb is, and this
The
is...
lamb is very rational. It
Yes.
says, I'm drinking downstream of where you are, so I cannot pollute your water.
Yes,
And
right.
it doesn't matter,
And it
says
says-
the loup.
it
La
doesn't
raison
matter.
du plus fort est
Oui, c'est
toujours la meilleure.
Exactement, c'est ça.
That's the moral of the story.
But,
Should I translate that?
Yes.
The reason of the strongest is always the best. That's the moral of the story, according to the wolf, of course.
Yes, and
And then he eats the lamb.
Yeah, of course it does. So the lying is an embellishment. It's just a kind of thing. And we didn't really get to that, but I'll make it quick. The sort of fables for me, when I became interested in working with them, were not just because of the sort of ground of climate change kind of shifting under these animals, right? Like Aesop or Jean de La Fontaine, I don't think could imagine what is going on in the ground right now, in the actual, in this, it's like inconceivable, it's unimaginable for, despite all the craziness of these fables and all the crazy things that happen, right? So it would not be imaginable to them, but that is, so it was first like thinking about the fables in terms of climate changes, in terms of the sort of ground shifting under these figures. But I'm also thinking, and I've thought more about it recently in terms of the sort of, not just extreme climate, but extreme discourse, right? So, Le Loup et l'Agneau, the dog and the wolf, the sort of fables, I'm thinking about the fables as figures in terms of a climate of just insane discourse, particularly here in the United States, if I'm allowed to say it.
In your interview with Jessica, you made a parallel between fairy tales and conspiracy theories.
Well, fables and fairy tales and conspiracy theories, yeah, it feels like we are moving backwards in time in a lot of ways, especially here. I mean, you talk about lying and crazy conspiracy theories and just the climate, the extreme discourse climate that exists here more than in Canada is coming. It is just, it's so strange that we have figures of fairy tale like Trump. He is a figure who uses rhetorical, sort of methods. Everything's about fairy tale. Golden Prince descending from a golden tower. All the language is about this kind of stuff. Like he, little this, lying that, sleepy this, whatever. It's all fairy tale rhetoric. I mean, it's all a kind of discourse that is based on that, and to the extent that Trump is in that sort of drawing I did of Le Chaboté, it is very much that kind of situation.
Is he depicted?
Yeah, that's his head.
Oh, we don't go up.
Just by the elevator.
We don't go to that painting and have a look at.
That's his head. I mean, he's the perfect kind of figure for this, right? It's really a sort of fairy tale figure of kind of trickery and representation in a context where there's diminishing social mobility, diminishing expectations, and so there's this sense of kind of moving back in time. And it's not just Trump who's a major figure in this world, in this kind of crazy world. It's like, in terms of Le Petit Pousset and the trope of abandoned children in the wood, Hansel and Gretel, Le Petit Pousset, Gretel saves the day, and the other, I don't have this figure depicted, but it's a background figure, which is like a figure like Greta Thunberg, who looks just like Gretel in Hansel and Gretel. We have a child, and has a name, and this is a child we're leaving to save the world. I mean, this is the real world we're living in, right? We're leaving a child to save this world, or presenting a child this way to save the world, and there are no adults. I mean, the adults, are like this kind of figure, right? A fairy tale figure. So there is this kind of strange world we're living in. That's where this is kind of coming
It's
from.
a wonderful, not an ending, but a suspension of this
Yeah, we've gone on too long.
conversation.
I've been talking
Leave it
too
on
much.
the
Sorry.
table. I would like to open it to the floor and start maybe with asking Anne, who wrote a review of the show in the Brooklyn Ray, what brought you, because you didn't know Carol's work beforehand, and you were immediately conquered, it seems. So, what made you write?
Well, Mark invited me to dinner, and I walked in and I said, I'll write about this. I love this work, which is rare because I have a hard time finding anything I want to write about oftentimes. This is extraordinary work. And also it's incredibly unique work. How old are you?
69.
I'm 77, and I was just thinking in terms of our period, it's extremely unique in many ways. And one is in terms of the relationship with the feminine. I have a huge library of fairy tales of Mary Louise von Franz, and where she talks about fairy tales and their relationship to the feminine. But we were kind of coming into our kind of adulthood at a time of Simone de Beauvoir, a time of, Betty Friedan, God help us, and, Kate Millett and Andrea Dworkin, and sort of it was a complete negation of motherhood. I mean, in the article I talk about Mary Kelly, and her accountancy of nappies and drudgery.
Yeah.
So
The
basically,
postpartum document.
yeah, all of the women basically, they were hoping that you could get an abortion, and that was our contraception, just so you dismissed motherhood. That was not something you were supposed to be dealing with at all. You were supposed to be completely liberated, get the same kind of power men had. And this whole realm of the feminine, it was like the baby was thrown out with the bathwater.
Literally in this sense.
Yeah, I kept thinking, the conversations with the dead hair, with boys with that hair. And I think that there was, the hair belongs to Aphrodite. It's her animal. And that is the part of the feminine that was really killed off. The part that dealt with with a kind of nurturing and positive human relations, and also motherhood, fecundity. And that was, and in a strange way, I said it in my piece that her work is like an incredible, she sort of takes up the cause again in a way that, a man couldn't have painted these paintings. These are definitely painted by a woman. And
We didn't get into gender there.
No, but I'm very happy that you're saying that, yeah.
Well, I know I'm politically incorrect, but I don't care. But I think that, this realm with the children is really quite moving, and that's what I found so incredibly moving about your work.
Thank you.
And also, it's interesting, you've got to I'll send you some of the Von Franz books, because she talks about the archetypal realm of the feminine and its relationship to the fairy tale. How this is, and the importance of fairy tales in the life of a child's psyche.
Right.
Like it's very important, for example, that children read Grimm's fairy tales rather than Walt Disney.
Yep.
Because they understand the complex relationships, like the witch who's incredibly ugly and has a wart on her nose may actually have the beautiful pearl in her purse that saves the prince and whatever. And Snow White, who's gorgeous, may have a poisoned apple.
Yeah.
So you understand the complexity of human relationships.
Yeah.
I think they're just wonderful. So I think someone else should talk.
No, but that was
Just an appendix
into
to
the
this.
gender
Are
aspect.
there writers today who are writing fairy tales? New fairy tales?
Oh,
Is it still a genre that's alive?
For me, I don't think it is possible to write them in the way that we're talking about these older tales. I mentioned in my little thing to you.
Well, they evolve too. Like Mary Louise Von Franz does this whole sort of this history of the fairy tale where they started as folk tales that are passed down orally through generations, and then they go through different mutations.
Exactly.
And you find a fairy tale and it has several antecedents in terms of other, they're passed down orally, so they're part of a collective psyche. So for someone maybe somebody's doing it, but I think we don't have that same experience.
No, I think it's impossible the thing that interests me about them, in fact, is the fact that you cannot recreate these things. These came from a particular time.
Yeah.
And
through a
Walter
particular time.
Benjamin's, yes, and Benjamin's whole, thing about them, which I appreciate in his texts, like The Storyteller, which were not the popular ones. They're certainly not the male popular, used texts, right? Not at all. They're very neglected. But when he talks about his interest in these tales, he talks about how it's like the most bare bones version that is the most important. The sort of non-illustrative, this skeletal kind of tale that gets embedded through telling, through telling over and over and over again, the repeated aspect of telling in different contexts. So no one could write one now in the sense that these are just skeletal things, and they derive their resonance and their meaning over time and over retelling in contexts that we cannot imagine right now in this kind of context of enormous amounts of information, right? It's just completely impossible. In the same way that what interested me, to go back to Anne's thing about reading, tales to children, what interested me about doing that was that it was kind of almost a recreation of a kind of, for me it was a hint of a kind of recreation of a time that one cannot imagine, and even to talk about it now is strange because, I had my kids in the 90s and was just sitting there reading to them over and over again in a time with no smartphone, no television, no laptop, no tablet, no nothing. That's all they had. That's all we had. It was this kind of, it was almost medieval. It was almost like, a book of hours, reading it at certain times of day over and over and over again. And it was a kind of an experience where, as Benjamin says, it embeds these stories into memory in a completely different way that is unimaginable. And that's why I don't think we could possibly write tales anymore.
But you made me try to introspect and look at my own childhood and try to remember if my mother was reading from fairy tale books. Probably she did, probably not as much as you, but then she wouldn't have done it if she had been as conscious as you are of the dystopian
I wasn't conscious of dystopian stuff when I was reading to my kids.
You were?
No, this was in the 90s. Climate change was barely on the horizon, and there was no things going on.
But the cruelty of parents abandoning their children in woods and that kind of thing,
that became an interest later. It wasn't the stories themselves that interested me when I was reading to the kids. It was the act of reading. It was the act of doing this. It was the act of kind of thinking about history, the history that these things came out of. That sort of led me to other kind of history, the sort of histories of French historians, history from below, Locke, Aliès, Lefebvre, people like that. Yeah, no, I wasn't thinking about these dystopian things at that time at all. I was just watching to see how children deal with story and how they deal with images as well. Illustrated books and the relationships between words and images, and how powerful the images were, and how reading to a child in a time like that, before technology, basically was almost some kind of hint of what it would be like. If you look at people like Huizinga's book on the waning of the Middle Ages, it was kind of like that. It just sort of embeds these stories in memory in a way. And children, when they first see, children who've never seen a television or a tablet or a phone, which we cannot imagine right now. It's unimaginable, right? But when a child first sees a book and asks for it again and again, and they see an image. I remember my kid looking at this book. It was a picture of a bear in the water. It was actually a really interesting semiological kind of book called Sand King. There's a bear in the water, and part of it's kind of cartoony, and you just see the top of his belly and top of his head, top of his legs and his arms, and the rest is flat. He's on his back. And my kid was like, the bear is in pieces. The bear is broken. The bear is, this image was so powerful. And I just keep thinking, like, this is like what medieval images would have been like in, when people saw them in a church, repeatedly. Yes. How powerful images were. Trying to imagine how powerful images were at a time, right? It's impossible now. Right? It's just not possible. But for children they are, and the way that they're embedded in stories, and the way that those things worked, it's just a kind of, maybe it's nerdy, but for me this was like, oh my God, it's like some sense of another time. Like you get a sense of history, and I get the same kind of sense of history looking at, tracing fairy tales or fables from like 1695 through advertising, postcards, all these sorts of things. It's like watching these figures walk down the sort of the feudal farm fields and into the early cities of the Industrial Revolution. It's like a living kind of sense of history that's really, I just find it fascinating. But also, I'm thinking about the future, so it's scary. as
There
shit.
we are.
Any other questions from you?
Oh, sorry, I'm talking too
Oh.
much again.
Yeah, we're thinking of the word agency,
Yeah.
if you would, quick ways.
Yeah.
When my children were small, my older daughter in particular, loved these books about orphans.
Okay.
You know, one the book that sticks in my head is the Boxcar Children. So these were contemporary books.
Yeah.
At that time. And what she was particularly drawn to were the ways that the children figured out how to survive.
Right.
And so I wondered about, in these stories, whether they found ways to survive or whether they were just victimized.
Oh no, they found ways to survive. I mean, in the end of the Petit Poussé, he, you know, after all these ventures and whatever, and this is like the world I'm living in. I keep thinking, oh God, we need something like this, right?
And,
Somebody's going to fix it. But
is he the only one to survive?
no,
Or,
no. All he brings his brothers back. He's,
Okay.
you know, he manages to. Oh,
So
it's
there's a
a
happy
really
ending
weird
then.
story. Well, except the ogre kills his own children by mistake. All of his own children, right? Yeah. Just read it. It's hilarious. I mean, it's not. It's not fucking hilarious.
Does the Petit Poussé grow up and have a...
No. It ends with Le Petit Poussé stealing the les bottes de 7 years, the 7 league boots. He brings us to his children back, despite the parents abandoning them. He comes back with the gold, and they live happily ever after.
All right.
But I
Yeah.
think the second part to it has to do, I would say, with the agency of the viewer. So
Yeah.
I saw the show last week. Beautiful, beautiful show. Came back because of the dog. You know, the way that you're mixing references in these paintings in formal and otherwise in wonderful ways. But a viewer wouldn't necessarily know about the fairy tale.
No.
It's a specific fairy tale.
Yeah.
But underneath this, and you keep coming back to this is a question of climate change. So there's a polemic, I would say, buried is probably the wrong word, I don't have the right word, but there's a polemic that the paintings are nested in, which is also something as a viewer I have to unpack or find or sense. So I wondered that because it seemed to me there was a tension in there because there's this visual complexity and semiotic complexity and all that, and then there's this political.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a polemic exactly. I mean, for me, it's just like because I worry about it so much. And for me, in a way, in the same way that the hairs are beautiful and I'm using something, you know, trying to find something, you know, in the past that points to a future, you know. In the same way, those particular tales and say those sources, those Le Petit Poussé postcards, which are just beautiful, they're painterly, the hand-tinted ones, and I just keep going to them. I don't think it's in a polemical way, it's in a desperate way, looking for something kind of,
presented as polemic,
yeah,
but
just looking
But
for
yours is
some
that
hope
very
or
strong.
some kind of, looking back at these things going, okay, maybe there's some hope. Maybe the kids will climb the tree, maybe they'll save us. Maybe the children will save us, you know, like this is, or save themselves, I mean, not us, themselves, and future generations. That's, yeah, I'm just kind of, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
There's so many levels, there's so many registers. You've got late 18th, early 19th century landscape painting, you've got collage, you've got children's drawings, you've got found photographs, the various themes. Is this a function of your search, of your research, of there's almost like a souvenir of your looking for information, or are you building a very complex metaphor?
I think it's a function of the search, and
So it's a result of the search.
Driven by something that made your research precisely
yeah,
that.
well, as Thierry said, with the thing you pulled from wherever it was, Jessica or whatever, it was like, it's more about trying to understand like, oh, I want to build a big metaphor archive. I don't know. You just get interested in this stuff.
So you're not speaking, you're thinking.
I'm thinking, yeah. I'm thinking.
Thinking
And worrying. Worrying.
Lisa.
Carol, I'm really interested in a couple things. One of which is that these paintings are generated off of these notions of scarcity, abandonment, and yet there's absolute no holds barred painterly pleasure in the making and the reception of these objects. And I have, as a viewer, as a fellow painter, I'm really kind of coming into contact with that. And the second thing is that I almost feel as if the sgraffito of these children's drawings that end up on the surface, like these tree outlines, like this children's drawing, and what we sort of, they don't hit us right away. They sort of hit us after we've had time to sit with them for a while. And it almost feels as if Carol Wainio, the painter, leaves the room, and the child of Carol Wainio enters the room and almost refaces her own paintings.
I've had that happen.
Does this sound?
Yeah, I've had that happen. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what those are there for. It's like somebody.
It also reminds me of something that you said to Jessica about leaving Nazca, where it's all about conceptual art, and being in Montreal and discovering the pleasure.
The pleasure
of
yes.
painting there.
Yeah.
Go painting!
There is pleasure. There is a lot of pleasure.
Yeah.
That's right. It's good that we are, and it's not the end. If there are other interventions, I'm happy to. I don't know, Mark, if we have more time.
Well, we have to be out of here
Oh,
by
okay.
about 8:25, so
Well,
we're nearing the end.
Yeah.
So maybe ending on pleasure would be a nice ending.
Unless someone has a burning
I wonder
question?
if there is still room for one or two questions. Carrie.
I'm just curious about the adults in that painting.
Yep, that's in the story, it's the father who leads them out, right? Back to gender, we didn't get into it enough. It's the father who abandons the child, same in Hansel and Gretel, right? The mother's kind of in this weird position. That's the adults abandon the children, the
So
father.
that's them leaving.
That's leaving. They're leading them into the forest in that section. They're going to take them out there and dump them. They're presumably going to find wood or something. But in this particular sort of tableau vivant kind of posed image, the children are kind of facing the viewer, and this was one of the things that I found interesting about those photographs is the way they're posed for the viewer, right? They're not naturalistic, like kind of leaving. The children are all looking at you. It's this kind of 19th century notion of childhood, and they're posed for the viewer. So there are all kinds of pictorial conventions that are getting played with there. But the parents are just disappearing into the woods. So there's a weird kind of reversal there in a way, because it's the parents who are disappearing, and the children facing. So
I see now.
Yeah.
Is the father?
That's the father with the basket. Yeah.
Okay, and the mother.
And in the other ones in the other room, it's this. They're similar. We're not looking at the ones in there. There's a bunch of the Petit Poussé ones in there as well, where the father looks kind of really.
So keep your stuff on and let us go to
I
the
think-
other room.
don't we
Maybe
need to
have
wrap
a
it
look
up?
at Trump's face in the Chabot.
On our way out.